What up, Vineyard? Hey, I want to tell you a few stories, and we're going to look at one little scripture and then maybe jump a couple thoughts out of that. Would it be all right? All right, so my parents were born and came together and got radically saved in the charismatic renewal of the 1970s, which means that my sister and I, when we were little, we went to a very charismatic church. And if people didn't fall down, roll around, cry, and scream, everyone went home a little bit disappointed. When we got to be middle school, my sister and I decided we wanted friends, so we wanted to change churches. And we begged my mom to take us to the Christian church in town that had a big youth group. She relented, and we were mostly relieved. We got a lot of friends. And for the first time in my life, I was pastored, and I was loved for just who I was. That was really amazing, but that's not the really amazing thing that happened. The really amazing thing that happened was I began to love God in a new way, but it didn't happen until I went to camp. And how many of you have had your lives changed at camp? Yeah. So I went to camp, and here's why. I went to camp for the same reason that everybody went to camp. You go to camp to chase girls and beat up guys. But what I didn't plan on is that we were going to worship at church camp. And we began to worship at church camp. And when we began to sing some songs to Jesus, suddenly the guy who had, for the most part, existed in the other room came into the room. I don't know about you, but for a long time, Jesus was always the guy who was in the other room. Like always at church. Like we would talk about him, we would read his book, we would sing a song about him, we would go on a mission trip for him, but Jesus was never really in the room. And something about camp brought Jesus into the room, kind of like what happened this morning when we just got to sit before him. And in the process of Jesus coming into the room, everything that I thought I knew about Jesus here made that 18-inch journey down into my heart. It became real for the very first time. And I began to experience the Lord. And like many of you, I began to experience him in worship. He was no longer the CEO who had given us orders, but he was a father. He was a brother. He was a helper. I was totally wrecked. I was so wrecked that at the end of the week, I went to the camp store and I bought this hat because I just felt love for God. And it was I don't know how to describe it. It was a hat, and it was really lame. And it had a cross on it. It was super lame. It had a cross on it. It was like teal and purple. It was like the Charlotte Hornets. It was in the 90s, guys. I mean, but it was lame. And even in the moment, I knew that it was lame. But I just didn't care because I loved God in a new way. On the back of it, it had a little scripture on it. It said Romans 5:8. I had good enough sense to figure out that if I was going to wear that hat, I better know what Romans 5:8 was. So I memorized it. And Romans 5:8 says this, that God demonstrates his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I wore that hat everywhere. Then another thing happened. I went to a Vineyard conference several years later. Our tiny little Vineyard church. At this point, I'm in a Vineyard church. The Vineyard, I'm like 18. That church sends my cousin and I to Anaheim, and we go to this Winds of Worship conference, and it's just a few months before John dies. John Wimber's up front. He's spraying pig spit into his mouth, and he's so entirely weak. It's unbelievable. He can barely stand up. He's leaning on the podium, and while he's talking, the power of God just hits the room like over and over and over. And in worship, we just kept being baptized in the love of God, just baptized in the love of God. Like what was happening here this morning, just baptized in the love of God. And then at the end, one particular night, they did a ministry time. I mean, it's the Vineyard, right? So I go up. And a man that I didn't know, and a man who certainly didn't know me, but I've come to know, comes and lays his hands on me. The man was David Roos. And David puts his hands on my shoulder, and he prayed some amazing things for me. Worship is happening. But the last thing that David did is he shouted at me, and he shouted as loud as a person could shout. He shouted the word freedom at me, through me. When he shouted the word freedom, I hit the ground. And I laid on the ground beneath the weight and the love of God for I don't know how long. And then I finally got up, and my cousin and I, we walked back to the hotel we were staying at. Here's the problem. Everything that was electronic or magnetic on my body died. My watch didn't work. My credit cards didn't work. The room keys to the hotel that we were staying in were dead. We were stranded in California by the love of God. So what do these experiences have to do with worship or even the scripture that I just quoted? Here's how I'd like to tie it together. Paul says in Romans 5:8 that God demonstrates his love. That's the kind of God we have. He demonstrates his love. And what that means is this, that God is knowable. God is knowable, and not just in our heads, but in our bodies. Yes, even our whole persons. God only demonstrates those things in which he has confidence in, and he has supreme confidence in the person of Jesus. The dead, buried, resurrected Son of God is real, and you can know him, the one who died on the cross forgiving the world. And I've known that most of my life in the head, but when I come to know it in my heart and in my person, that's when I begin to worship. And I'm telling you, I started knowing that in worship. I knew it a little bit in my head. I knew it enough to sing, but when I sang it, I knew it more. This is the power of worship. Worship is a force multiplier of everything you think you believe. You come to know it more. You don't have to know it a little bit, but if you know it even a tiny bit and you begin to vocalize it, your whole body begins to resonate with the truth. And when your body begins to resonate with the truth of Jesus, when your body begins to resonate with the truth of the resurrected Son, when you begin to resonate, and by resonate, I mean not metaphorically, I mean actually resonate. This is the power of singing. This is the power of sung worship congregationally. It is that anointed lyrics hit our mind, melodies touch our hearts, and our lungs expand, and our actual bodies begin to resonate with the truth. Even if it's this big, you end up stepping into the more, because God is an infinite person, and we begin to experience him in radically dynamic ways. Vineyard, we will never give up this thing that is so precious. Just to sing to the Lord, to sing to him. Jesus is absolutely beautiful. He's the most beautiful person in the universe. And when we begin to align ourselves with him, we can come into an infinite knowing of God. However well you know him now, it's not to the degree that you could know him even still. And how do we do it? We just begin to sing. Because here's the thing. The articulation of a thing is the consummation of a thing. You don't even really know it until you express it. I love my wife, and when I tell her, it creates the context to love her more.